Hello and welcome to today's webinar on how to generate budget-friendly recipes. This webinar is designed in response to questions that I have received from students and agency partners regarding resources that we have and best practices around creating recipes for low-income clients at risk of hunger. When we began doing more and more with recipes and resources, it was in response to the needs expressed by participants of our mobile markets. When we surveyed our participants, over 85% said that they wanted recipes, they wanted to know how things taste before they try it, and they wanted to know how to preserve the foods that might go bad. So we wanted to provide them all of the resources that they needed to accomplish those things. Since the vast majority of what is distributed at our mobile markets is produce, we also wanted to make sure that we were providing the necessary information to meet our participants' needs so that they were more likely to consume the produce. So let's get started with what it looks like to have a successful recipe. A successful recipe is, first of all, accurate. This means that if it says it takes it makes 6 1-ounce servings, then that's what it really makes. And that the ingredient quantities are correct and in proportion to the rest of the meal. The recipe should be consistent in format, with abbreviations consistent throughout. So, for example, you don't want to use a capital T for tablespoons and then switch to writing out the word tablespoons, because that would be inconsistent. And inexperienced cooks need very clear, consistent instructions. Additionally, the ingredient names should be consistent. So if we talk about flour early in the recipe and then we talk about whole grain flour later, it would be potentially confusing. Recipes should be approachable and include readily available ingredients so that they're using things that they are familiar with. They have a limited number of ingredients in the recipe and simple instructions so that participants feel confident in making the recipe. Additionally, you will want to make sure that you are asking participants to use equipment that they already have or are familiar with. And so a list of equipment needed is also a really good idea to add if you have space. You will want to list the cook and prep time in the recipe so that the user will know if this is something they would make on the weekend or if it's something that they can handle during a weeknight with all of their busy schedules because it takes less than 30 minutes. And then finally, I want to encourage you to take photographs of the recipes and include a nice inviting photograph on your recipe. I've seen many interventions that contain plain recipes with no logo or photograph and lots of white space, so they look more like a letter even than a recipe, which isn't very inviting. Plus, if participants can see the picture, they have a better idea or whether or not theirs turned out the way it's intended. Your recipe should have a simple, obvious name, but don't be afraid to incorporate some fun seasonal words or memories. For example, not your grandmother's sweet potato casserole certainly tells you what it is. It's a sweet potato casserole, but it also invites the idea that it could be a makeover recipe and perhaps a bit healthier than what your grandmother used to prepare. You want to include numbers or bulleted directions instead of paragraphs so that it's easier to stay on track with the various steps. Include the nutrition information if you can. One easy way to do this is to set up a MyFitnessPal account, then enter your recipe and specify the quantity that it will give you, and it'll provide the nutrition breakdown for each serving. You can then use that information and plug it into a free online food label generator, and it will give you a JPEG that you can then download and use into your recipe. And we've used that extensively and it works really well. If possible, you'll want to use a larger print for audiences that may have difficulty reading a smaller font size. And then finally, your recipe should be delicious. I think that goes without saying, but you'll definitely want to try it. And particularly if you are doing a recipe makeover, and adjusting it for lower fat or sugar, you want to make sure that the consistency is what you're expecting and that the flavors are all still blending well together. So let's kind of jump right into the do's and don'ts. Here's a list of things that come to mind when we're creating recipes. First, as I mentioned, you're going to want to list all the ingredients in order that they will be used and match the step-by-step instructions exactly. You will want to provide the step-by-step instructions in numbered or bulleted format, as I mentioned before. And just for your information, the list of ingredients is not the part of a recipe that has a copyright. It is actually the narrative or how to put the recipe together that has the copyright. And so just kind of keep that in mind. So you could take, for example, a list of ingredients in a potato leek soup, but you turn that into a potato leek pizza, and it has completely different instructions, different steps, and your narrative would be completely different. So that's an example where you could do that. You will want to create sections to break up ingredients that are from different elements. So for example, in a recipe that has a crust, a filling, a topping, or a dressing, you'll want to break up the ingredients so that all of the ingredients that go with the dressing are listed together, and then all of the ingredients that go with perhaps a salad, those would all come together. Likewise, your crust ingredients, you'll typically see those first, and those will be all listed together, and then all of the filling ingredients will be listed after, and there will be a nice heading there so it's really clear which ingredients go for which element of the recipe. It's important to not use two numerals together because this can get very confusing visually, and you can do this one of two ways. You can either use a parentheses so that you would have the numeral 1 and then an 8-ounce written in parentheses, and then you can write package or can or whatever the item comes in. Or you can spell out the number 1, O-N-E, and then write the numeral 8-ounce package. So there's kind of two ways that you can do that, and you can see on the slide where I've done that, where I wrote out the number 1, and so there's only one numeral, which is the 8. Vice versa, you could do a number 1 and parentheses 8-ounce and then package. So those are the two ways that are pretty customary to see quantities so that you don't have two numerals together. For simple ingredients, you can also add the technique, which can be helpful and save a little bit of time when you get to the step-by-step instructions. So for example, you can do 2 eggs beaten, and so that way by the time they get to the steps, those eggs are already ready and they're already been beaten. Or for example, 2 tablespoons of butter softened. It's really good to put that kind of information in the ingredient list because then they have already set it aside. It's softened by the time they actually need it in the instruction part of the recipe. And then divided ingredients are listed as divided if they appear in multiple places throughout the instructions. So for example, you could list a 1/2 cup of flour, comma, divided. And then clarify ingredients such as percentage of milk for low-fat items or percentage ground beef, etc., if necessary. And keep in mind that for low-income participants, 95% lean ground beef, for example, may not be economically feasible. So consider including in, suggestions such as rinsing the cooked meat to remove a lot of the fat, which will lower the percentage of fat that's in the beef if they, for example, buy a ground chuck because it's on sale or maybe it's a BOGO item. They can get that a lot cheaper than a 95% lean beef, but in order to remove a lot of that fat, they can just rinse it underwater, and so that gives them a little bit of flexibility so they can still stay within their budget but make your recipe. You'll want to describe how things will look or feel if you think there could be some confusion. For example, I have a cookie dough recipe that I've been using for years, but the first time I made it, I thought I did it completely wrong. And then when I read in the instructions, it said it will look very dry and crumbly. And I've never seen a cookie dough recipe look like that before for sugar cookies, and so I expected it to be very cohesive, and yet it definitely was not. And I thought I would normally think, oh, I must have messed up on the liquid, or I need some more milk or water in this. But what happens is once you dump the whole crumble bowl onto the counter and roll it out, then it becomes very cohesive and it works really well. So they put that little notation in the instructions so that I wasn't alarmed when I got to that step and it just didn't look right to me. So always include things like lumpy, or it'll be dry, or you'll need to mix it for 5 minutes and halfway through it's going to look like it's not working, but keep going. I think of things like one ingredient ice cream. If you've ever made that before with frozen bananas, you take the bananas, you peel them, put them in the freezer, and then you can put them in a food processor just by themselves. They don't need any flavor, and you start to grind that up, and it doesn't look like it's going to turn into anything for a while, and you got to keep going and keep going until finally all of a sudden it becomes a really smooth, creamy ice cream textured dessert. So that's a perfect example of wanting to make sure that people know what they're looking at as they kind of go along, and just encourage them to keep going until it turns to a creamy consistency. If you can, indicate the bowl sizes or skillet sizes if appropriate, so that people have a good idea of what they need to use. For example, I hate it when I start a recipe and it doesn't specify, what I'm going to be doing, and maybe I haven't read through the whole recipe first, which tends to happen often for me, but I will start mixing ingredients together, and all the dry ingredients in one bowl, and then start mixing the wet ingredients together, only to find out my wet ingredients have to go into the dry ingredients bowl, and it's too small of a size to accommodate everything. So if you need to have ingredients mixed in a large bowl because other things are going to be added to it, just make sure that you list that so people are prepared and don't get frustrated with your recipe because they didn't know ahead of time. Indicate the level of heat. So if, for example, you want ingredients to be sauteed on medium heat for 5 minutes, make sure you list that so they're not cooking too high. Or if you want to have meat seared on either side, and maybe you want them to cook it for 5 minutes on each side, you need to list that so that they know what they're doing and know how much time to spend. At the beginning of your recipe, if the oven needs to be preheated or something needs to be at room temperature, it's always good to sort of list that in the very beginning so that it's ready in the instruction when you get down to the step-by-step instructions. If your recipe step involves stirring or tossing, go ahead and say so they know what to do with it. And then you never want to mention things like serve with rice or serve over pasta without having listed it in the ingredients and have steps for the preparation of those items. It would be very frustrating, as you can imagine, to get through this whole recipe and then find out in the end that you need to serve it over pasta or rice, which you haven't prepared, because that's going to take a while to do. So you want to make sure you mention that in the ingredients list, but then also mention it in the steps so that it's ready. So now let's talk a little bit about recipe layout. This is one of the funnest parts, I think, of kind of putting a recipe together, because it's a little bit of playing Tetris and figuring out sort of how to make all the pieces fit together with the right font size so it's very clear and easy to read and easy to follow. You want to create a title that's clear and inviting, as I mentioned. Spend some time creating a head note that describes the textures, memories, maybe essentially just tells a story of why the reader would want to read the recipe. And we will spend some more time discussing head notes later in the webinar. And as I mentioned earlier, photos serve two purposes. They let the reader know that they're on track with the recipe so that they can check and see if theirs looks like the photo, but it also provides a visual stimulation for the reader to want to look further. I mean, how often have you seen a photo on a website or a blog and then clicked on it because it looked really good to see what the recipe was, right? You want to list your ingredients clearly, as mentioned previously, and then provide the directions in bullets or numbers after or next to the ingredients. List the equipment if you have space, the nutritional information, and reference the author if needed. So here's a little bit more information about copyrights as it's been explained to me in a recipe workshop. Anything that you write automatically has a copyright associated with it, regardless of whether it contains the copyright symbol or not. And so that's an important piece of information to know. So if you are reprinting a recipe verbatim, go ahead and ask the source and get permission since you're doing it completely verbatim. And typically they will be happy to let you reprint it as long as you list that it's coming, that they are the source and they get proper credit. If you are testing a recipe and you are writing it in your own voice, maybe you've changed a couple of ingredients even or changed a method, you can mark that as adapted from and then list the source. So for example, we may take a Share Our Strength recipe that's in one of the 6-week culinary classes and we have changed the sugar, maybe lowered the sugar, maybe lowered the fat, maybe even adjusted the serving size a little bit and made it a little bit healthier from our perspective. So we will mark it as adapted from Share Our Strength so that they get proper credit and that we have referenced, the original recipe. If you change the recipe and you write it in your own voice, you may mark it as inspired by. And then a rule of thumb is to err on the side of caution and give credit where credit is due. Assume that all recipes have copyright unless they are in public domain. And public domain is very tricky, and I'll explain why. The reason is that public domain can actually mean two things. First, it's a legal term that is used to describe works without copyright protection. So usually these are older works who have had their copyright expire. The second is that it is a broad term used to describe things that are public, such as works posted online. So this means that some things can be in the public domain in the more mundane sense, so meaning that they are online, but not be in the public domain in a legal sense, meaning that they are your own work from your blog or your cookbook. So that's why it gets very tricky to try and figure out what is public domain and what is not. Considering that you don't have to register your work to have copyright protection in it, nor do you have to include the copyright symbol with it, it's always best to assume that everything you see is copyright protected until you can prove otherwise. And certainly, to be honest, I wouldn't go through the trouble to prove otherwise. I would just mark it as inspired by, adapted from, or if it's completely different. And for example, I have a pizza on my blog that I got the idea from a potato leek soup. I changed a number of the ingredients. I still use potatoes, but I had goat cheese and I had bacon and all kinds of other things, and I made it as a pizza. It's essentially a whole new recipe. I got the idea from looking through a potato soup, list of recipes, but it's not something that even remotely looks like the potato soup. So that would be something I wouldn't have to worry about putting adapted from, inspired by, because I simply got the idea to do a potato leek pizza, but from looking through other recipes about soup. So hopefully that makes sense. So let's go a little bit more about equipment. This is really interesting and definitely something to keep in mind when you're looking at creating recipes for low income. Not everyone has access to a kitchen, which I think you all probably realize that now. When we did some surveying of our mobile markets, 97% had access to a kitchen. So that means there's still 3% that were potentially picking up produce or other items that they may not have had the ability to actually prepare. There's confusion between what's a blender and what's a food processor, which I think is really interesting. And when we did our survey, overwhelmingly people said they had a blender. There was some really strangely observed peer pressure to also say yes, that they had a food processor. And so we would talk about the differences and had, pictures so they could see what they were. But, we caught, someone else in line saying, yeah, you have one of those, just sort of encouraging them to say yes. So I don't know how accurate even this 39% number is. I feel like it's a little high, and that most people probably that are low income do not have a food processor. So a lot of times if we know that a recipe that is inspired from something else that does require a food processor, we will make some changes, some adaptations to it, but we will make sure that it works in a blender so that if all they have is a blender, they can still make it. So that would apply to things like smoothies or maybe sauces and dips like our spicy bean dip, those kinds of things. We would want to make sure that those work in a blender because they're more likely to have a blender than a food processor. And mixers are always really inexpensive, so those are a great appliance to use with recipes when appropriate. So just make sure you keep in mind equipment and thermometers at the bottom of this list. 43% had thermometers. That may be an accurate number. I feel like it might be a little bit high based on, the years of working with participants. And so if you're going to require in the recipe that they heat something to a certain temperature, just keep in mind they may not have a thermometer to do that. So just kind of a good thing to keep in mind that there could be differences in equipment, and so keeping the equipment as simple as possible to equipment they're likely to have is going to be the best option. So let's talk about head notes, because this is where you can really get pretty creative with recipes. So I did a workshop with Fancy a while back, and one of the things that we had to do was we had a picture, which looked fabulous, and then we had a recipe list, and then we had to create a head note from that recipe. And so my group came up with this following head note, knowing you've got some, colored cabbages in there and a lot of different textures. As the leaves change and we are reminded of, excuse me, as the leaves change and we are reminded of the vibrant purples and reds of fall, we gather together to enjoy cooler temperatures with outdoor meals. The sweet and crunchy texture of this nutrient-rich slaw is the perfect addition to your cookout or family gathering. So from that, you can just really see all of those beautiful colors on leaves of fall. You can think about going to the park and doing some cookouts with hot dogs or hamburgers and kind of enjoying some more family meals maybe outside because the cooler temperatures are in place. And so that's kind of what you're going for with a head note. It's telling a bit of a story and at the same time enticing the reader to want to make that recipe for maybe their next cookout or their next potluck or tailgate. And so I also wanted to kind of address some of the ingredients that happen to be in this particular recipe. One of the things that I've done here on your slide is added some items in gray just to kind of talk about simplifying recipes. So this recipe, I've not made it, but it looks like it would be great. But I can see where if they don't have Granny Smith or Pink Lady apples, that they could probably use any other kind of apple and it would work okay. It just may not be as tart. Because it's not using the exact same apples. So I might be inclined to eliminate the kind of apple or maybe make a note of, whatever apple you have on hand. If I'm specifying an apple, that's fine as long as I give them the flexibility to use what they have on hand. When it gets down to the onion, they could use a red onion, but my guess is they could probably use a sweet onion or a white onion or a yellow onion, and it may still be okay. for the walnuts, I kind of passed by that one, but coarsely chopped I think is fine. I think that it's probably going to end up coarsely chopped, and I don't know if they'll know exactly what coarsely chopped looks like. So I might be inclined to just leave out the word coarsely so it's not intimidating and they just have chopped walnuts. And they can probably handle that. And at the end of the day, it's probably not going to matter whether, frankly, they're whole or they're in really fine pieces. It'll all still work. And you can also look at the olive oil. So extra virgin olive oil is great if they have it, but they could probably use a canola oil, which they may have on hand. They may not have an extra virgin olive oil on hand. And then the teaspoons of celery seed. I'm pretty sure most of our participants do not have celery seed. I'm not even 100% sure that I have it in my cabinet. So it could be that you can substitute a different spice or seasoning in that spot, or leave it out altogether if you don't think it substantially enhances the recipe. And then for the salt, I just eliminated the word kosher because I felt like they may not know what kosher salt is. They may not have it. It might be an intimidating word, so just doing some sort of salt would probably be fine. And so just kind of keep in mind ways that you can simplify ingredients to make them a little bit more user-friendly. And then we're going to move into low literacy design tips now. And so I mentioned so many of these again, and I sound a bit like a broken record, but I just want to make sure that you're kind of thinking of all the considerations as you move forward with your recipes. So they need to be limited in ingredients, have lots of white space because that helps you navigate your focus, and then simplify the language and the number of words that you're using, as we talked about in that last recipe. And then simplify your font. So use an Arial or Calibri because those work really well. You don't want to squish up your text so that everything's too tight, or use all caps because it is very distracting to the eye and can be very hard to read. And then generally I like to have a justified alignment. However, sometimes that looks very awkward, and so you want to use flush left if justified looks awkward. And when I mean justified, sometimes it'll pull the sentence apart to make it square, and then you end up with weird spacing, which can be hard to read, so you don't want that. Avoid hyphenation, so anytime you have a hyphenated word, just kick it into the next line, and it'll just be much easier for your reader. And then add some bursts of color or use of color to differentiate different things. So if I have maybe a box that contains all the components for a dressing, I may have that as one color. And then the salad ingredients itself I may have as a separate color box. So you can see that your different elements of the recipe are also characterized by different colored boxes of ingredients. Use visual cues to reinforce messages, and you know, things like a picture of a blender versus a picture of a food processor, so they know which equipment item they're going to need to use. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about photographs. This is, I think, an area that can be a lot of fun. It can be actually a little addictive because you start sort of seeing things in picture format once you kind of get going with this, and you think, oh, that would be really great to photograph if I just turned it at this angle, and you know, and so you can kind of get a little crazy with it, but it is a lot of fun. So generally the recommendations that I received in sort of my experience has been to shoot from overhead and then shoot very wide, because then you have lots of options regarding cropping the image later. Adjust your lighting on your iPhone by locking the image with the yellow box. You just simply hold in the middle of the yellow box and then it will blink and it will lock your image into focus. And then if you notice, there's a little sun on the side, and you can touch your finger on that and scroll up or down to add more light or to make a darker image, which you probably wouldn't do, but there may be an instance for that. And then use the 2/3 rule when it makes sense to do so, with the item showing up in 2/3 of the shot. So if you see the soup, the muffins, Those are, even the pizza dough is in 2/3, but the pizza itself, I didn't shoot that way. In fact, I didn't shoot it overhead at all. I shot it at an angle because I wanted to show the depth and texture of the bacon, the goat cheese, the potato slices, caramelized onions and leeks, and the arugula. So are you hungry yet? Use soft light that's natural with no flash. You may have a window of opportunity each day where the light is optimal, so you'll want to plan your photography around that. For example, in my home, the light is best from 8 to 10 in the morning, and I have a corner of the house where light actually ironically comes in from both directions, which is really ideal. It sort of bounces off the house next door and is able to come in on through 2 windows. So between 8 and 10, I'm golden. I can shoot anything, and I have really great natural light. What happens if you try and do something maybe in the evening, you end up with a real yellow tint to it, and it's really hard to work with. So using natural light will be really important, and just kind of pay attention to when you have the best lighting. At the office, we use our conference room because it has a whole wall of windows. We can move closer over to the window, and we've actually taken a graphic image of an old wooden table, had it printed on a canvas, and then we use that as our backdrop so that all of our filming is on that, and then we just roll it up and put it away. So we can use any kind of card table or anything, and that's a really great trick as well. Adding texture from ingredients, from plates, doilies, etc. is really a good idea. Just make sure it doesn't take away from or compete with the item that you prepared, because you want to make sure the focus is on the food and not on your accessories. And so next we're going to talk just a minute about the difference between a recipe versus a template. I think you can see it a little bit clearer on the screen here. Recipes are really great, and we have all of our recipes, like I said, have the photographs, and they have the step-by-step instructions, and we know it's a proven recipe, so we know that it works if we give it to our participants. However, they may also want a little bit more flexibility and want to be able to use what they have on hand. And so that's where we kind of move toward this template model. The challenges with that are that, one, you don't have a photograph of it because you don't know what they're going to use. They are easy because you can just dump anything in the different buckets and it's going to work. They're, for the most part, foolproof, but it might not be the best recipe or side dish that they've created. But like I mentioned before, they can really use what they have on hand. So for example, in this Veggie Made Simple, they would use, say, 3 cups of broccoli, use some olive oil, put the garlic in there, add the broth, typically how I make it, and then salt, pepper, and garlic powder, and put it in the microwave for 5 minutes, and you've got a really flavorful side dish. And so it is a bit foolproof. So those are kind of nice to have the flexibility. We've done some studies using both options, and it's very inconclusive as to which people prefer. I think the best case scenario is we have some one-page items on our blog that you can take a look at, and they have the template at the top, and then they have the recipe on the bottom that demonstrates that template. And so people can see, okay, here's the template, how I would use it, but here's an actual way that it works. And I think those might be sort of the best case scenario because they kind of have both. That way, if they don't have the items in the recipe, it's no problem. They can just throw the ingredients they do have into the different buckets, and they can make it work. And so lastly, I've just provided a little bit of resources that you can use and kind of see some of the things that we have. I think the SNAP recipes are a good place to start, just to kind of take a look at what limited ingredient recipes look like. We use, you know, ideas from food blogs and cookbooks and even watching a cooking show, sometimes I'll get an idea to do something completely different. Like I said, maybe it's a soup and I end up making a pizza out of it. There's some additional information on the bottom of this resource list that helps you kind of think through what clear language looks like and how to design your instructions so that they're very, very, very simple. And then, of course, we have on our Share Our Strength, or on our food blog, we have the Share Our Strength resources, and then we have recipes. You can go there, get an idea for maybe one of their recipes, and maybe, again, you turn it into something completely different, where it maybe is a side dish and you make it into, a casserole of some sort. Or maybe you use those recipes as they are, but you tweak them a little bit and show them as adapted from Share Our Strength, and that's perfectly fine. You're welcome to do that. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics has a really great resource on cultural food practices that I would recommend when working with different population. It kind of is a good refresher from back when you did your dietetic internship or maybe your nutrition coursework on, what some of the nuances of different religions, different cultures are, so that you can make sure that you have recipes that are suited for those. And of course, you can always reach out to us at any time. We're happy to answer questions, or if you want to shoot us a copy of a template and get my thoughts on how it looks or what my experience has been and where you could maybe make it even better, we are happy to do that. My email address is jill.brown@foodshuttle.org, or you can reach out to Elizabeth Weeks at elizabeth.weeks@foodshuttle.org, or if you have no luck with those email addresses and want to just give us a call, our number is 919-250-0040. And I hope this has been helpful. And again, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or want any additional guidance. Thanks.